Welcome to Voice Daily Finance, the most important news personalized for you every day. Supported by Voice.com.
All right, we've got three big stories for you today. First up, we'll cover the bombshell appeals court ruling that just declared Donald Trump's global tariffs illegal, a case that has Apple and Google rethinking their entire supply chains. Then we'll dive into the bizarre no hire, no fire labour market, where companies are buying AI instead of hiring people. And finally, we'll take you inside the tech arms race for reservations at a New York Indian restaurant called Bungalow, which is now looking at a $400 million valuation. A US appeals court just dropped a bombshell ruling declaring most of former President Donald Trump's global tariffs illegal and setting up a potential showdown at the Supreme Court. Now, what's really interesting here is that this legal fight wasn't started by massive corporations with deep pockets, but by a coalition of small businesses. We're talking about companies like a boutique wine importer, a fishing tackle supplier called Fish USA, and even a company that makes bicycles for women. They argued that these tariffs were an existential threat, with one small business facing an extra $1.2 million in costs. So this is a real David versus Goliath story. This isn't a minor legal challenge. The decision affects tariffs imposed on most countries around the world, including major trading partners like China, Mexico, and Canada. This is where the situation takes a more complex turn for major tech companies like Apple, Google, and HP. For years, they've been in a state of supply chain whiplash, spending billions to move manufacturing out of China and into countries like Vietnam and India, precisely to get away from these tariffs. They called it de-risking. Now, with the tariffs potentially gone, they face a huge question. Do they reverse that incredibly expensive process, or is the world too politically tense to ever go back? In a 7-4 decision, the court rejected the argument that the tariffs were permitted under emergency economic powers, calling the levies, quote, invalid as contrary to law. And get this, the ruling is incredibly specific. The court targeted the use of one particular law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA from 1977. The judges basically said this law is for things like sanctions and embargoes, not for inventing new taxes out of thin air. It means other tariffs, like those on steel and aluminum that were justified under a different law, Section 232, which is about national security, are not affected by this ruling. It's a kind of presidential authority shopping, and the court just closed down one of the stores. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Donald Trump fired back, stating that if the decision is allowed to stand, it would literally destroy the United States of America. He called the ruling a total disaster for the country and predicted it would be overturned. This is about a fundamental power struggle between the branches of government. The court's 127-page ruling argues that the power to impose tariffs is a core congressional power and that the Emergency Powers Act never granted a president unlimited authority to do so. The judges wrote that when Congress intends to delegate that authority, it does so explicitly. The reason this is so fundamental is because it gets to the heart of our Constitution. There's a legal concept called the non-delegation doctrine, which basically says Congress can't just give away its most fundamental jobs. And the power to tax and regulate commerce is one of its biggest. The court is reinforcing the idea that for something this massive, a president can't just act alone without a crystal clear permission slip from Congress. But that's not the whole picture. The ruling is paused until October 14th, giving the administration a window to ask the Supreme Court to take the case. The fight is no longer just about trade policy. It's about who holds the ultimate power to tax and control the flow of global commerce, the president or Congress. The final decision could upend decades of American foreign and economic policy. From a legal battle over economic policy to the real-world impact on the ground, the US labour market just hit a wall. New data shows job creation has cratered, with employment gains averaging just 35,000 jobs per month over the last 3 months. To put that in perspective, that's a steep fall from 123,000 during the same period last year. But what's really catching Wall Street's attention is a strange contradiction. New jobless claims are actually falling. Economists are calling it a no-hire, no-fire market. So the thing is, companies are increasingly using automation, artificial intelligence, and scalable software to boost productivity without adding people to their payroll. A recent Richmond Fed survey found that about 1/2 of all firms have implemented labour replacing automation in the last year, For big companies with over 500 employees, that number jumps to a staggering 75%. They're essentially buying technology instead of hiring talent. Companies aren't letting people go, but they have slammed the brakes on bringing new people in. This is creating a dangerous illusion. One lead economist at Oxford Economics warns that slower labour force growth is masking some of the potential fissures in the labour market. So what are these fissures? The problem is that traditional numbers like the unemployment rate don't capture the whole picture anymore. They often miss people in the gig economy or on short-term contracts. The real story is hidden in alternative data, like hiring trends on professional networking sites, which show a much more fragile situation. And the cracks are starting to show. A new Conference Board survey reveals the share of consumers who believe jobs are hard to get just spiked to a 4.5-year high. The slowdown is being attributed to a protectionist trade policy that has driven the nation's average import duty to its highest level in a century, cooling off domestic demand. This has the Federal Reserve caught in a bind. Fed Chair Jerome Powell is signalling a possible rate cut, acknowledging rising labour market risks, but he's also warning that inflation remains a threat. This decision to cut rates brings both potential benefits and comes with inherent risks. Traditionally, cutting interest rates makes it cheaper for companies to borrow money to expand and hire. But in today's economy, why hire a new team when you can invest in a scalable, low-cost technology that does the job for less? The link between interest rates and hiring is getting weaker, leaving the Fed with less power to stimulate the job market. This all leads to a bizarre situation where even as layoffs remain low, the unemployment rate is now forecast to tick up to 4.3%. The big question is, how long can a no-fire market hold on when almost nobody is getting hired? We were just talking about companies choosing technology over hiring, and believe it or not, that same dynamic is now playing out in the world of fine dining. Let's start with a single statistic that might just change your entire perspective on this industry. Reservations for a New York City restaurant are selling out in 30 to 90 seconds. The nightly waitlist averages over 1,000 people. This isn't just about popular food. You know, behind the scenes, it's a full-blown reservation tech arms race. To manage this demand, high-end restaurants are using platforms like Resi and Tock. And interestingly enough, these platforms are often owned by financial giants like American Express. This creates a digital velvet rope where premium cardholders get privileged access, turning a simple dinner reservation into a commodity. It's gotten so intense that bot services scalp reservations for over $100, leading New York to pass the Restaurant Reservation Anti-Piracy Act just to fight back. The restaurant is Bungalow, part of a new wave of upscale Indian dining transforming the industry. Forget cheap food and curry houses. We're talking about a segment now aiming to rival French and Italian cuisine. And it's a business that has investors scrambling for a seat at the table. What really brought this to a head was the incredible complexity of their operations. To achieve this level of authenticity, these chefs are running complex international supply chains. They're sourcing hyper-regional ingredients, meaning a specific spice from a single state in India has to land in their New York kitchen. This involves navigating stringent FDA and USDA import regulations, securing certificates to prove products are pest-free, and building trust with suppliers thousands of miles away. It's a huge part of what you're paying for. How serious is the money? The private equity firm L. Catterton, backed by luxury giant LVMH, just took a stake in the UK Indian chain Dishoom, valuing it at a reported $400 million, and that's before it even opens a location in the US. One restaurateur, Roni Mazumdar, says just 5 years ago, no investor would have even considered Indian cuisine. Now, he's in continuous conversations with them. After all, when a firm like L. Catterton gets involved, they have a specific playbook. Take a beloved, culturally specific brand and scale it for massive growth without losing the unapologetic authenticity that made it valuable in the first place. It's a high wire act. So what's driving this explosion? It's a 1-2 punch of demographic and economic power. The Indian population in the US has surged by 174% since 2000, and it's an affluent group with a median household income over $151,000 in 2023. The situation presents a fascinating duality. For decades, academic studies have shown that non-European foods are often described with words like authentic but also cheap. This new trend is flipping that script entirely, elevating regional Indian food to a status of luxury. But it also raises a new question. Who gets to define what is authentic when a cuisine becomes a status symbol. This isn't just a story about food. It's a story about a cultural and financial shift. These restaurants are becoming destinations for celebrities and billionaires, including Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. After dining at Bungalow, he reportedly told the chef, "I know why every Indian in Seattle is on the phones at 8 a.m. PT to snag a reservation, because for them, this is not just visiting a restaurant, it's a pilgrimage back home."
That's it for today on Voice Daily Finance. Follow, share, and stay tuned for daily updates coming your way tomorrow.